The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
Super Bowl 52 Media Week continues. Jason Bryant with a rare opportunity to get here on Media Row, or Radio Row. I'm disguised as the Boston Herald right now with Joe Favorito, PR.
I'm disguised with a lot of things. That works out really well.
People might think that's an Eagles scarf you're wearing.
It's actually a Seattle Sounders scarf. So,
well, it's that soccer thing that we talk about, that kickball.
Yeah.
Pretty good team out there. Pretty good fan support out there.
Yep.
Your expertise, Joe, first of all, at Joe Fab, because like you said before we began, everybody needs more followers.
You can never have more followers,
and
more than enough followers.
JoeFavorito.com. And reason we're having you on the show, you've got some experience in promoting wrestling, doing it from a PR standpoint, and you've got experience pretty much. You've had MMA fighters here this week. You've had all. First of all, what has been your role here at Super Bowl 52 this media
Every
week?
year I will get my primary client here is Nickelodeon. So anything that Nickelodeon does in sports throughout the year, I'll work with Kids' Choice Sports. They have a massive partnership with the NFL, so we'll bring talent to Radio Row. We'll slime people in the Super Bowl experience. So it's a little bit of everything.
So as far as today, here where it's Thursday, time's winding down.
My week is over. It's the best part.
Oh, so you can take a deep breath until your next jaunt. So for a day-to-day operation for a PR guy like you, what you've got this big event. You said you got the big client Nickelodeon. Mm-hmm. So no day seems to be a day-to-day thing for you. I mean, it's
hour to hour.
How would the course of a typical week go for you?
It doesn't. You never know. That's the best part about it. I mean, I have clients big and small, Nickelodeon, Intel. Pick up little projects here and there, movie projects. I'm going to start working on The Contender now for Epics. So it's different. I mean, I've been doing this on my own now for 9 years. We ran the IFL for 2.5 years before we kind of folded it and sold the assets to the UFC. Had a great time working with USA Wrestling. I work with Beat the Streets every year with their event in New York. So, it's all about storytelling. Everything is about storytelling and figuring out how you can take somebody's story and take it to as many different audiences as possible. That's the challenge and the opportunity.
As it relates, you brought up the IFL. I had the opportunity to cover two of those events when I was working with the National Wrestling Coaches Association. Later on, you were seeing the USA Wrestling logo on the canvas and on the mat surface
that's
places
when I was there.
With the IFL. And, of course, people were sitting there wondering, why is USA Wrestling getting into this MMA stuff? From your perspective, was that a good relationship with USA Wrestling?
It was huge. I think at that point it was something that the UFC had no interest in. We had a bunch of wrestlers. It worked out really, really well for cross-promotion to really help USA Wrestling at a time where they were trying to figure out where they wanted to go next, get outside of kind of their traditional audience, and establish a tie with MMA at a time when MMA was really just kind of coming into the mainstream. So I thought it worked out really well.
We've seen kind of a contraction of sorts of MMA outfits. Of course, the IFL is no longer there. Some of the other outfits are no longer there. But the IFL tried to go with the team aspect. In hindsight, was that something you thought maybe the fans could get behind, or is it something that there's that monster named the UFC that was probably just a little too big?
I think that there were a lot of things that we did. And it's funny, I was talking to a fighter from Bellator yesterday who's actually going to fight Roy Nelson, Big Country, in his next fight, who was one of our guys. Mm-hmm. So we were actually, because of the way we were structured, we were way ahead of our time in a bunch of things. Some things that the UFC actually picked up afterwards. I remember when we eventually folded, there was a conversation with Dana White. He said, the one thing you always beat us in was PR, which I thought was great. But, we had the first live fight on television with my networks. We had a partnership with Tops. We had a lot of non-endemic sponsors that wanted to try MMA and couldn't try it with the UFC at that point because it was a little bit too renegade. That worked out really, really well. And we had, we reintroduced a lot of the coaches back into a sport that had kind of abandoned them. Their relationships with the UFC at that point weren't great. We brought them back in, a lot of them, like Pat Miletich. Renzo Gracie went on to work with the UFC again. So it was really good. And I think contraction is something that happens in a sport like that. There's a lot of similarities now between where esports and gaming is going and where MMA was 10 years ago. And you're going to see a lot of the same thing where people are going to rush into something, not know what it is, waste money, kind of burn out early. But the ones that will be solid will be properties that will live. And you've seen that with Bellator. and UFC, a little bit of World Series of Fighting. So, there'll be a market for it, but it will level out at some point.
And I'm glad you mentioned the esports thing because you know how wrestlers can wear their emotions on their sleeves, and we're always feeling like we're passed over when it comes to media opportunities. And why is poker on television? Now we're seeing esports. We're seeing colleges try to start esports teams. Granted, not through their athletic departments, but through the university and other aspects. And then it's on TV and these giant conventions that draw thousands and thousands of people. And then they're putting kids playing video games on TV. Where can wrestling try to say, all right, we're not going to miss the boat again because it looks like the next thing that's going to capture people's attention are going to be things like esports?
Well, there have been efforts recently to try and figure out how to kind of crystallize the qualifying for the World Championships and eventually for the Olympics into a series that could go some places. The biggest thing is money. You've got deep pocket supporters in wrestling like you do in lacrosse, people like Mike Novogratz, who have looked for opportunities to grow the sport beyond what it is. The biggest challenge is time. Mm-hmm. I think that there are certain aspects of wrestling that play really well into an audience now. And it's really the effort. Time and money are the two things you need. So you have to find the commitment of people that have a vision that will grow it beyond wrestling, but never lose the core. And that's important. You always have to keep feeding that core and figure out how to grow it. You don't need wrestling video games. You have to figure out what makes sense and where to spend that money. I think personally that colleges who are now growing wrestling programs, the successful ones, I look at what Rutgers is doing in New Jersey, number one wrestler at a weight class for the first time ever. They have to figure out how to promote that as a forethought, not an afterthought. So figuring out where it is and then telling the stories of the wrestlers to places that are beyond what they would normally get. That's all that you need. But you have to have people who are passionate about it, focused on it, and know how to tell the stories.
So how has this made your job and your role as a public relations guru kind of difficult? There's always the target changes with the advance of technology.
You have to stay ahead of it.
10 years ago, Twitter was not really a thing for promotion. Now, Twitter's got live streams with Stadium, and we can watch things on your phone. And the opportunity for wrestling, where can we as a sport capitalize on those type of things, and how can people like you help that?
You have to see the ability of two things: the quick moments on a mat and the personalities of those wrestlers who are on the mat, and figuring out someone has to be constantly thinking about how to market that. I actually think USA Wrestling's done a pretty good job in figuring how to take on the digital space, but they're just the NGB. Every school has to do it. Wrestling clubs have to figure out how to do it. And you have to have someone who has the mindset of coming into it not as a wrestling person, but as seeing it as a property that has an audience. And once you see the property as an audience and the personalities that go into it, and there are a hell of a lot of great personalities in wrestling, just like there are in MMA, just like there are in lacrosse, you have to figure out how to capitalize those. You've got wrestlers with big social followings, Helen Maroulis, Jordan Burroughs, Kyle Dake. Their followers are endemic because they're part of the sport. You have to make sure that their stories are being told away from the mat. So I've worked with USA Wrestling going into and out of the Olympics for the last 3 Olympics. We caught lightning in a bottle with Helen Maroulis, who I think continues to be a bright star, but it has to be everyone pulling in the same direction. That's the biggest challenge. When you get to a certain point, you can't forget that you're a wrestler first, and keep feeding that base. And then you can go and do a lot of other things if you have the right personality. It has to be a commitment on the point of the wrestlers as well, that they can't say, oh, I can't go and do something because I have to go do something that may or may not affect my training. You have to get a little bit outside of your bubble and realize that you have to be committed to growing your sport beyond what it is that you do from a day-to-day basis. It's not easy. It's not for everybody, but there are stories out there that can be told.
Are we, as a sport, based on your experience, looking at us as a wrestling community, are we looking too hard for that crossover star, the person that can show up?
I think they exist.
They exist?
I think they exist. I think it's a big part of it is listening. You're out there and you have your head down and all you're thinking about is wrestling a lot of times. When you're not sitting there and looking at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and figuring out what those other assets are that you could maximize. I think that exists every day. You just have to have people that are thinking about it, and a lot of it just comes down to money. If you can find people that are committed to spending the money and looking for a long-term play, and brands that are looking to access a passionate fan base that wrestling has, it's there's plenty of opportunity that's out there.
A lot of it always, again, comes back to money. You've mentioned it a couple times.
You can do a lot with money.
Where people also struggle, and again, I think I'm in this situation, having worked in the media for a long time. I know that a lot of these television spots are determined by advertising dollars, and why is wrestling, great numbers on Big Ten Network streaming, but as far as television goes,
forget about television. The world is changing. We're moving into a world of controlling your own medium, building your own brand, and influencer marketing. I'm going to start working with, believe it or not, Premier League darts, which in the UK will draw 18,000 people.
180!
Exactly. So it will start streaming.
I'm a dart player.
The first, today is February 1st. BBC America did a test on New Year's Day and had 40,000 live engaged streamers watching darts from the UK.
Again, back to the East, people are watching darts. People's viewer interests are different. How does wrestling
But they're
capitalize?
playing to a niche. Wrestling has a huge niche that it's never exploited.
Does wrestling's trying to fight to not be a niche? We should niche down more so?
I think you have to maximize the people that are there and then maximize the community that you have. After that, you'll pick up pieces on the outside that will grow.
Well, we're niched within our own niche because high school wrestling fans don't necessarily become college wrestling fans. There's that separation between high school and college
But you
fans.
have stars that can grow and can go outside. So if USA Wrestling brought Jordan Burroughs to Radio Row on the Tuesday of Radio Row, you could book 50 to 100 interviews. But nobody thinks like that in wrestling.
Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And this is a wrestling state.
Yeah. Nobody thinks like that.
Mike Max is here from one of the local stations. He actually used to host a wrestling show on television here locally. Yep. And, that was going to be kind of leading my next question. What's going to take to get an athlete, a Helen Maroulis here? I mean, what would the demand be?
Someone who has the story?
What's the tie-in to the Super Bowl? That would probably be my question as a media guy.
So I was here with, on Tuesday, I was here with a boxer, just won the super light middleweight crown, Caleb Truax. The hook is that he's from Minnesota.
Right.
So we booked 70 interviews. He brought his belt. You have a wrestler who brings a belt, who brings a gold medal. Carolyn Joyce, who is a silver medal Olympic swimmer, was here for 2 days doing interviews. She's not from here, but she's got a good story, and people were looking for good stories. If you can talk a little bit about football, and I'm sure there are plenty of wrestlers who can talk a little bit about football, and there are probably wrestlers with ties to Minnesota or ties to Philadelphia, big wrestling city, that you'd be able to book someone here earlier in the week. Now, when you get to Thursday, Friday, it's crazy.
Right.
I wouldn't try and do it. But, people are setting up here on Monday. Next year next year we will be a year and a half out from Tokyo. It is in Atlanta. There are brands that have engaged in the sport of wrestling. You look at brands that have been around like ASICS, Under Armour, who have spent money in the sport, have wrestlers under contract. That's where I would go next year, Monday or Tuesday, is figuring out who the best story is, figuring out how it lightly ties to the city of Atlanta and the NFL. And by the way, you mentioned it. You've got personalities in the NFL who are wrestlers. So what would it take for...
well, Golik's here. He's sitting right behind us with ESPN, but he's kind of a guy.
So Ray Lewis.
Right.
Big wrestling fan. Mike Novogratz would bring him to Beat the Streets every year. Loves the sport. What would it take for Ray Lewis to spend 3 hours
and you're saying
Super Bowl?
Personality. I mean, Golik's it was a lineman. It does maybe not have that draw to people, whereas like a Stephen Neal, who's a wrestling world champ, is an offensive lineman. Lewis is
Kyle Snyder.
Yes. Well, Lewis it was a dynamic, make plays type of guy. So maybe is that the type of
There are plenty of people. There are plenty of people you could find. The question is, will someone commit to the time and the money to do it and figure out that this is a great way to grow our sport?
That is where your expertise lies. Now our next event, at least what we're going to hear from you, Beat the Streets coming up. It's going to be right around the Final X Series. I know that
in May.
They're working on that. And from the start of that event, I went to the first couple. Actually, I missed the first one on the Battleship because it was my honeymoon.
That's the only one I didn't work.
But,
I've worked everyone since.
Times Square, I remember calling the bout with Rulon that first year, and it was remarkable. What's the difficulty with you there? Because that is an event that's more or less a fundraiser, but it's also a big media opportunity, but it's also in the center of the busiest intersection in the world, it seems. Like, you're not looking for entertainment eyes there. You're looking just for people to stop. I mean, how do you market that thing?
That's the opportunity. So the great thing about it, it's really the only time of year where there are elite wrestlers, men and women from different countries. And by the way, marketing internationally, that's been one of the great things about Beat the Streets is they're always looking to bring in wrestlers from other countries who have their own media following who just happen to be in New York. So
it's also the media hub of pretty much North America.
Yeah, but I think you can create that in different places. And I think taking advantage of that and bringing wrestlers around to various places in that strategic moment, whether it's Citi Field for the Mets, Radio City, Broadway, it's something that people expect every year. So it's not easy, but it's not that hard. I don't think any of this is hard. I think you just have to spend the time to do it. If you have a good story, there are people that are willing to talk to you.
From a PR perspective, what's the most marketable thing about the sport of wrestling?
I think there's a bunch of things. I think the changes that brought the rule changes that brought wrestling back into the Olympics, the growing wrestling community with women, I think is really, really important. I think the growing wrestling community that's part of the Latino community, that Henry Cejudo helped jumpstart, is really important. I think the personalities are really, really important and very strong. But you just need people focused on it. There's not enough people working. Gary Abbott does a tremendous job with his team at USA Wrestling, but they are focused on wrestling and the business of wrestling and getting events done. You need people who are looking bigger than that. Rich Bender's done a good job of thinking bigger and figuring out how to do it. It just takes time, and you have to have people that believe that this is a marathon and not a sprint.
Joe Favorito at Joe Fav, joefavorito.com. Appreciate the insights. We'll have to pick this conversation up later in the year because I want to hear more.
Yep, anytime. I love the personalities around wrestling, the men and the women. We always find niches, and when you listen to them, you hear things that they're telling you. The people who are involved in the day-to-day just know about, but they don't think about how to market it. When you bring people in from outside, that's where the opportunity grows.
The Short Time Wrestling Podcast is proudly outfitted by Compound Clothing. Shirts, singlets, custom gear orders, everything you need. Call up Cliff and the crew at cmpteamwear.com. First time listening? Well, you can change that by going to MattTalkOnline.com/GetShortTime to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or listen on your favorite podcatcher at MattTalkOnline.com/listen.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.